Well, good morning, everybody. Instead of letting that music play one more time, I think let's get us started. It is 10 o'clock on the hour, and I know Alex has a lot to share with us this morning, so I'm going to kick us off. Welcome, everyone, to CSU's Got Talent. I'm your host, Maddie Shao, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's session. We have Alex Madva joining us to talk about his recently published book, Somebody Should Do Something: How Anyone Can Help Create Social Change. And because Alex is from Cal Poly Pomona, he is going to give this a CSU spin. So he did publish this book along with two other co-authors, but he's our own CSU friend. So here he is to join us this morning. So Dr. Madva is, like I said, joining us from Cal Poly Pomona, where he's co-director of Digital Humanities Consortium, as well as director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy. Let me switch this over right here. Alex, welcome to CSU's Got Talent. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Alex Madva to today's session. And let me get you over here so you can begin your presentation.
Thanks, Maddie, so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure collaborating with you on this and other projects, and I'm super grateful for everybody at the CSU's Got Talent team for this opportunity. So I wrote a book with a couple friends. Actually, as of about a week ago, the audiobook is now available on Spotify and Audible. It's going to be up on everywhere else pretty soon too. So you could hop over to somebody-book.com to learn more about the book. We've written some op-eds, podcast interviews, stuff like that, as well as links to the book. And you can also just snap that QR code for more information. So my co-authors on this endeavor were Dan Kelly from Purdue University up here, and Michael Brownstein, who in full hipster form is showing off the hen from his chicken coop in Brooklyn. One of the main topics that we think about in the book, and that we're going to be thinking about specifically as it applies to our role in the CSU today, is how can we, as individual members of the CSU, connect our personal choices and social roles to broader structural change. Okay, and I just discovered my president is in the chat, so not nervous at all about presenting in front of all of these amazing people. So the kind of fundamental problem that we are thinking about in the book is what we call the problem of either or thinking, which often frames individual change and structural change as competitors. So there's stuff I can do as an individual, there's big structural change that's out there in the world, and often these can seem like two alternative choices that we think leads to a lot of confusion. So instead, we propose what we call both and thinking about these issues, ways of thinking about what are ways that I can connect my individual choices with larger structural changes, and what are ways that we can build larger structural changes to empower individuals to do more in their own lives. And the upshot of this sort of way of thinking is that it's going to turn out that individual choices do matter, but not in the way that we usually think. Okay, so to get us set up for this, I would like to briefly offer you a brief history of our brainwashing, the way that we've been brainwashed especially in the United States, but also more broadly in Europe and other parts of the world, into incredibly individualistic ways of thinking about social problems. So one first example takes us back to the 1920s, when US car companies realized they had a problem. The problem is well depicted in this photo right here, where you see lots of people in the streets along with the cars, right? So before cars came along, streets were used by people walking, they were used by horses and buggies and so on, carts. But once cars started entering the scene, then the natural next problem that started happening is those cars started hitting people. And so there were more and more accidents. And one person who was worried about this was John Hertz, who founded Hertz Drive Yourself Stations, which you may recognize the name, that went on to become Hertz Rent-A-Car. And he wanted to try to come up with a way of thinking about these issues that would reduce the number of accidents. And so one thing he said was, we are living in a motor age, and we must have not only motor age education, but a motor age sense of responsibility. The streets are for vehicle traffic, the sidewalks are for pedestrians. And so those of you who got here before our session began probably saw one of our quiz questions. One of the things that the folks like John Hertz tried to do was to stigmatize people who had the audacity to walk in the streets. Okay, and the term that they came up with is still with us. All right, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, right? And that is the jaywalker. So the at the time, the term jay was referred to like a country bumpkin. And so this was like an effective insult. It was like saying, oh, you don't know how to walk around in urban spaces. You don't know how to be a hip, cool person in urban spaces. You're just a country bumpkin. You walk like a jay. And revealing something about his own political sensibilities, John Hertz said, "We fear the jaywalker worse than the anarchist." Okay. But of course, although they were primarily focused on trying to stigmatize foolish people on their feet who were trying to walk in the roads, they also wanted to say, hey, drivers bear some responsibility as well. So let's try to come up with a term to stigmatize them. This one didn't catch on quite as well. The term they came up with was flivverboob. Okay. But, A plus for trying. So around the time that they were developing this campaign, there were movements building to look at these problems in a different way. For example, in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1923, 14,000 people signed a petition to install governors in car. And so the idea, like what a governor would do is it would cap the maximum speed at 25 miles per hour, right? And sometimes to this day, people still talk about like, why don't we just actually cap the speed of cars at 70 miles an hour or 65 miles an hour or whatever it is so that people literally can't speed, okay? But the no vote campaign, backed by industry and probably also supported by people who liked driving really fast, crushed the attempt to sort of put the responsibility on car makers to make cars less safe rather than putting the responsibility on individual pedestrians for I would be so pleased if flivverboob like went viral after today's session. Let's make it happen. We can do it. Okay. So of course, this strategy of putting all the blame on individuals for these larger structural problems has played out again and again across a large range of contexts. Many of you may, like me, have grown up with Smokey the Bear, who said the number one way to fight climate change is with the number one way to fight fires is with climate regulations and better ministry of our forests. No, what he said is only you can prevent wildfires. Another, probably the most influential public service announcement of all time featured this gentleman right here, Iron Eyes Cody, who, despite the way he is presenting himself there, was actually an Italian American. And in a very famous commercial, it concluded with the words, "People start pollution and people can stop it." Okay. And that ad was sponsored by Keep America Beautiful, which, despite its name, wasn't so concerned about keeping America beautiful. That was actually a consortium of people who, executives from cigarette companies and chewing gum companies and snack companies and beer and canning companies. And they all shared one thing in common, which is that they were producing and selling goods in disposable containers. So at the time, for example, Vermont actually passed a law banning the sale of goods in non-returnable containers. And once again, the industry realized they had to change the conversation. Instead of putting the responsibility on themselves to stop producing things that would just end up in landfills, they brainwashed all of us into thinking it's our job to take care of our little corners of the world and not pollute anymore. Pretty much every alcohol commercial you come across is going to tell you to drink responsibly, right? And they are putting the responsibility on you to be a more responsible drinker, okay? And of course, many of us are familiar with the tactics of, for example, the NRA, where Wayne LaPierre, former leader of the organization, said the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? Or guns don't kill people, People do, as we all know. Okay. And so in each of these cases, they have effectively persuaded everybody, or many people, that the problem fundamentally resides with us as individuals, right? And full disclosure, one of the people they persuaded was me. Okay. Thanks to growing up in the most individualistic country in world history, I basically assumed for most of my life that what it meant to care about the environment was to, for example, track and reduce my personal carbon footprint, to recycle, to turn off the lights, to think about what's all the little things that I do that could produce greenhouse gases and how can I reduce that, right? Actually, the idea for the carbon footprint um, initiated in, sorry, I'm just laughing at the we're made of carbon thing. Okay, the idea of the carbon footprint initiated in academic contexts, but it was popularized by the oil industry, formerly British Petroleum, which then became Beyond Petroleum, where again, instead of taking the responsibility on them to stop producing oil for or creating carbon taxes and so on, they brainwashed all of us into thinking that it was our responsibility to reduce our personal emissions of greenhouse gases. So the strategy again and again is to tell us to forget about these kinds of structural reforms and just take individual responsibility to deal with them. Now, naturally, in the last 10 years especially, there has been a movement against this individualistic way of thinking about these problems. So here is a satirical headline from The Onion, which states that woman separates yogurt cups into cardboard and plastic as 95 private jets land in Venice for Jeff Bezos's wedding, right? And so again, the idea is the tiny thing that this little individual is doing, she's just separating the plastic and the cardboard. Like clearly that's not going to make a difference when we have tons of 95 private jets flying to Italy for a wedding, right? A pretty viral piece in Vox magazine went around in about 2019, the headline of which said, "I work in the environmental movement. I don't care if you recycle," right? Stop obsessing over your environmental sins, fight the oil and gas industry instead, right? Or as the slogan was then taken up by then presidential or candidate for the Democratic nomination, Elizabeth Warren, "I want big structural change," right? Stop fretting over these tiny little things we can do as individuals. Let's go for big structural change. One way that this idea manifested was in memes that went around about the Ever Given a few years ago, which was a giant container ship that got trapped in the Suez Canal. And here you see, here is this giant container ship, that's climate change. And then there's this tiny little digger that's trying to scoop out from the coast there to try to move the thing. And that's our individual actions, right? And so it's like our individual actions are pointless against this giant structural change. Another context where the same argument comes up, and these are the two central cases we focus on in the book, climate change and systemic racism. So here the Ever Given is depicted as systemic racism, and then this tiny little digger is just a diversity and inclusion workshop. And what is that tiny little action going to do to affect these larger changes, right? And so it's sort of encapsulated in this broader way of thinking where it's like, here's this big structural problem, and then here are these tiny, insignificant personal choices, right? And the message seems to be the individual choices don't matter, okay? So I think that these messages about structural change are really important. But when we think about governments, when we think about industries, when we think about big corporations, they are not nameless, vacuous forces sort of out there in the world that are just like the weather, right? Much like Soylent Green, governments and businesses are made of people, okay? And so I think with that in view, we can start to sort of think about how potentially a necessary correction could become an overcorrection, right? So this sort of structural response to individualism, where we've all been brainwashed into taking individual responsibility for these larger structural problems, that's a necessary correction to the individualism. But there's a risk that it could sort of trade one oversimplified model grounded on individual responsibility for another oversimplified model where the big structural changes are just out there, and what can I as an individual do to affect them, right? And so the concern is that we could be reinforcing an either-or dichotomy between individual action and structural change, right? So The concern here is that when we appropriately are emphasizing that these are large scale structural problems, some ways that we could talk about that problem could undermine our own ability, our own confidence as individuals to try to find our roles in social change. Yeah, the boat did get dredged out of the Suez Canal, but weather conditions also helped. So it wasn't just that tiny little digger. Okay, and so again, the lesson is going to be that individual action does matter, but not in the way that we usually think. So here is a different story, one based at my own institution that is not necessarily a huge example of structural change, but I think it's a good example for pointing us towards different ways of thinking about our role for making a difference. So as Maddie mentioned in the intro, one of the hats I wear at Cal Poly Pomona is to direct the California Center for Ethics and Policy. Each year, we focus on a different theme of national and international significance, and we bring together CPP students and faculty along with local and national and international experts to think about these problems, things like misinformation, the climate crisis, artificial intelligence. One year, our focus was on housing insecurity and homelessness, which, of course, I don't need to tell you is a huge problem in California. And it's also a huge problem for our students. One national study found that actually 56% of students in 2019 were facing housing insecurity, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't have somewhere to sleep, but that they didn't necessarily have a stable residence that they could rely on. So we were hosting a series of panel events about this, where we brought in different experts talking about different aspects of the problem, different ways of solving them, and then we would have open-ended discussions at the end of these panels to talk about addressing them. One attendee of one of those sessions was Jeff Mio, who is now emeritus. He's a multicultural psychologist, and he said, "Hey, of course, we're not in a position to simply create tons and tons of housing for all of our students at Cal Poly Pomona. But here's one thing we could do. What if we created PO mailboxes so that students who were struggling with housing insecurity could have their mail delivered to campus?" And this is, particularly relevant because in many cases, if you're applying for jobs or scholarships or other sorts of opportunities, you got to write some address down on the form. And what if they could just write a Cal Poly Pomona address? And so a number of us were really moved by his suggestion. And so a few of us got together, including me, Brady Collins, my colleague in the political science department, and a bunch of students, including CCEP student fellows and students in one of my classes. And we kind of created a task force, makes it sound a little more grandiose than it is, but a group of folks who were meeting regularly and coming up with a plan. And eventually, as a result of our efforts, what we then called Project Mailbox actually is part of the institution at Cal Poly Pomona. So if you go to our Care Center website, you'll find Project Mailbox there. We didn't end up getting actual PO mailboxes, but we did create a system where students can now put a campus address down on forms and go and pick up their mail on campus. So here are a couple noteworthy features of this sort of case, right? Well, it started with a kind of brainstorming event. So we got a bunch of people together, people with different perspectives on these issues, different experts, different people, suffering from housing insecurity. And it was an opportunity to share our knowledge and experience of these problems. And then we had a kind of open conversation to brainstorm solutions. And I think one really important feature of Jeff's suggestion for how to deal with the problem was that he wasn't just saying, like, we got to figure out how to make individual students more responsible so that they, are saving up more money so that they can afford rent, right? What he instead did was pay attention to the situation or structure that students find themselves in. What are the obstacles in their way that are making it harder for them to succeed? And so he wasn't focused on their individual habits or traits, but thinking about the situations that they found themselves in, and could we potentially lessen the obstacles in their way? And then a group of us got together where we met regularly, where we committed to deadlines, where we committed to deliverables. And so, it wasn't just that we walked out of that meeting saying, like, yeah, let's fight against housing insecurity, right? It wasn't just a matter of depending on individual motivation and willpower. We created a group where we were holding each other accountable, right? It wasn't just depending on me as an individual to try to do all the work, but to a group of people who are holding each other accountable. And I would like to echo the thanks to John for the awesome handout. I am very grateful for that, and we'll be stealing that in my future presentations. So the another important feature of Project Mailbox was that the output of our group was not just a plan, but a kind of institutional implementation, right? The goal was to build it into the institutional DNA at Cal Poly Pomona, that there were going to be, for example, social roles. There's going to be a person who's responsible for receiving that mail, taking care of it, giving it to the students when they come to pick it up. There are physical locations for having it delivered, right? We're building it into the structure of the system that there's now a way for this to happen. So instead of just going to an event and thinking like, it's really bad that that's a problem, somebody should do something, right? Not just expecting the institution to take care of it. We realized that that somebody was us. So one thing that Joan Baez likes to say is action is the antidote to despair. And I think that's a wonderful way to put it. But I would add one tweak, which is to say acting together is the antidote to despair. Okay, so I think to kind of step back and be a little more abstract about this, what are some of sort of the right ways and the wrong ways, or the potentially misleading ways to think about individual difference making? Let's do we can't do shows of hands, but let's do send a Zoom reaction. If you have ever, it could be a heart or a thumbs up or a cat smiling or whatever it is. How many of you have voted in an election that came down to a tie or a single vote victory? Okay. Now, maybe you voted in like your high school chess team. Wow. Okay. Pretty good number of hands. We do have 252 people. Oh, nice. We got the cat smiling. Good. Okay. Does anybody care to share in the chat what was the context where you voted in an election that came down to a tie or a single vote victory? Which is to say, if one person had voted differently, or if one person who hadn't voted had, or had voted hadn't, then it would have turned out differently. Does anybody have examples in the chat that they care to share? Sixth grade class president lost in a coin toss. Nice. I think, okay. So vote for what's for dinner tonight. Always a tie. Oh, jury deliberation. Wow. Okay. That's intense. Right. So a striking feature of these scenarios is it's often like a very small group of people, right? But if we're thinking about larger elections, such as voting for president of the United States, what are the odds that the state of California is going to come down to a tie or a one vote margin where it's a tie of votes for the Democratic nominee versus the Republican nominee? Okay, extremely small, right? But this way of thinking about making a difference is often the kind of pitfall that we can fall into when we're thinking about individual difference making, as if the reason for me to vote is because my individual vote will all by itself tip the scales, right? And so the natural metaphor here is thinking about like a bucket that's being filled up with drops, and every individual just has to add a drop to the bucket, and it'll get filled up when enough individuals do so. So another way of thinking about opportunities for change comes from a different example. So how many of you have ever worn an I voted sticker? Let's see those smiling cat faces or thumbs up, or I'll take a heart. Sure. Okay. Ooh, lollipop. Nice. Okay. Some of these images I don't recognize. No dogs. This is a cats only space. Okay. The screaming face. Okay, great. Okay, so the ghost. Nice. I love the creativity in the emojis that we're sending. Okay, so a lot more of you. All right. Now here's a question for you to consider in the chat. Why do you do that, right? Why is it that you might be motivated to wear an I voted sticker, right? There's a couple different reasons that might be something that you do. What are some of the reasons that might lead you to do that, right? Okay, so Aaron just jumps right out of it off the bat. Aaron talks about virtue signaling, yeah, to encourage others to do so too. Belonging, sense of immunity, encourage, not get left out. Okay, great, right? So when we're thinking about wearing that I voted sticker, right, we're not just thinking about my individual vote will make a difference. We're thinking about maybe other people will see that, right? I think there's some other dimensions to wearing that I voted sticker as well, which we can talk about in a moment. Okay, so Again, so if we're just thinking about individual difference making on the analogy of elections, we're falling into this trap of thinking about individual difference making as just adding drops to a bucket, right? Maybe my vote will be the one that tips the scales. Another context where we can have a kind of narrow frame for thinking about individual difference making is when we think about, say, our personal carbon footprint, right? What's causing climate change? It's all the production of greenhouse gases in the environment. And so it's just like, well, if each of us can just reduce the number of greenhouse gases we're emitting as individuals, then maybe we can reduce climate change. A different context, slightly different sort of case, is someone might think, oh man, structural racism is this huge, terrible thing. I have no idea what I could do to combat segregation or economic inequality or exploitation or marginalization or mass incarceration or any of the other huge structural problems facing racism. And they might think, well, here's one thing I can do. I can at least treat every individual that I come across with respect, regardless of their race, right? I can react to people based off of the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, right? And again, of course, that's an important thing to do, but is that really going to be key to bringing about larger scale structural changes? So instead, we need to adopt some wider frames for thinking about these issues. The first sort of shift in analogies that I think is really important is instead of just thinking about each individual action as a kind of drop in the bucket that adds up over time, social dynamics don't work that way. So social dynamics are often marked by tipping points and phase changes where a lot of people are trying to work towards something, and it seems like the larger scale effect that we're aiming for is we're not getting there. It doesn't seem like we're getting any closer. Okay. But actually, a better metaphor than adding drops to a bucket here is boiling water, right? So you could think about each individual action as increasing the temperature, increasing the dial just a little bit on water, right? And the water is getting warmer and warmer and warmer. It's gradually getting warmer and warmer and warmer. Each individual action makes it a little bit hotter. But is each addition of heat equivalent to the one before it and the one after it? No, as a matter of fact, at a certain point, you hit a tipping point, a phase change, when the water starts to boil. When you get to 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the water actually completely transforms. And so there are some individual actions that are like the proverbial camel that breaks the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. Got to come up with a less violent metaphor for that. But there, certain individual actions that actually lead to larger tipping points where things cascade in a more positive direction. So one way to start thinking about this is instead of just thinking about what are the material consequences of me recycling more, me composting, me biking to work rather than driving, the reduction of greenhouse gases that I'm emitting, what are the effects of my actions on other people, right? And so many of you, when you talked about wearing that I voted sticker, you were thinking about other people seeing it, right? And so one of the key slogans that we have in the book is that we are each other's situation. So let's take some small scale changes like the decision to quit smoking. What predicts whether someone will quit smoking? Is it that they are really concerned about their health? Is it that they can't afford to buy the cigarettes anymore? Those factors can certainly matter. But the number 3 biggest predictor of who quits smoking is when a friend quits smoking. The number 2 biggest predictor is when a family member quits smoking. Can you guess what the number 1 predictor is? It's when a spouse quits smoking, okay? Similarly, what predicts whether someone will put solar panels on their roof? Is it that they are really concerned about the climate? Is it that they really want to save money over time? Both of those are factors. But actually, the number 1 predictor of whether someone gets solar panels on their roof is whether their neighbors do, right? And these are all examples of ways in which our actions can role model and shape the situations for other people. Now, when we're thinking about having an influence on other people, there's one person in particular that we might be concerned about, which is the other person being yourself. And the actions that you take today shape the person you become tomorrow. So, for example, some studies have found that people who initially report having bought solar panels just for the sake of the savings actually become more likely to vote for the Green Party later on. So that initial step that they took to take a kind of pro-climate action can kind of bootstrap them into being a more committed fighter against climate change going forward. And similarly, maybe when you rock that I voted sticker, you're saying, hey, I'm a voter, I'm a citizen, I'm someone who cares about the political process. And that one step that you take might be an important one towards making you a more committed, politically engaged person across a range of different aspects in your life. So with these kinds of big picture questions in view, I'd like to pose a question or two to y'all. So let's imagine the following what would you do hypothetical scenario. Let's say, and I know this is purely hypothetical and none of you will have experienced this, that you perceive your colleagues are paying lip service to equity commitments, but they seem less ready or willing to take meaningful and potentially costly actions for real equity. So here's the question. How do you convince others of the need to take action and make tangible changes, right? In other words, get folks to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So let's start with just throw some reactions. Have any of you found yourself in this scenario? Thumbs up if you've ever found yourself in this scenario, or the unhappy smiley face as well. Alligator. Okay, the chicken found themselves in this scenario, or maybe that was a rooster, not sure. Okay, right. So now another question we can ask is, if for those of you who did find yourself in this scenario, were there any gaps between what you did in that situation and what you wish you had done? How did you actually handle that scenario, and what do you wish you had done in that scenario? If anybody wants to drop any ideas in the chat, that would be welcome. Jonathan Fales also points out that the tipping point is the cost of the panels. Yes, so we also see, for example, tipping points in technological changes. So the plummeting cost of renewable sources of energy like solar and wind is a huge factor in shaping the fight against climate change. And tipping points are also something we see in these kinds of technological cases. Okay. So Andy said, yes, I was reactive versus compassionate and understanding. I appreciate the honesty there. Refer to CSU policy requirements. Okay, fair. So whatever you did in that situation, or if you haven't yet found yourself in that situation, how do you think you should handle the situation, right? So maybe some more compassion and some more understanding, maybe understanding the CSU policy requirements. What are some steps you might take going forward for addressing that issue? I think Jessica's point is also really important, that in many cases, when we engage with someone, if they don't immediately say like, yes, I have had a transformative experience and I will follow you in your quest to make change, then we think we're just wasting our time and we're not making any difference. But in fact, change happens over time, right? And so especially if we're thinking about sustained relationships with our colleagues, the conversations we have today can shape the conversations we have tomorrow. And if we're thinking about this in longer terms, then patience can be really valuable, right? Speaking up and saying something versus ignoring it, directness with leadership rather than skirting around the problem, suppressing its severity. Maybe talk to them and see what may be causing the hesitation, right? It's important to find others who support the cause. That's find other allies. That's a really great approach. Assume good intentions. Approach the conversation from what support they need. Meet them where they are and try to move forward from there. These are all awesome suggestions. Okay. But now, let's think about what are some of the structures in place that might make it easier or harder for somebody to walk the walk. And while we're at it, what are the structures in place that might make it easier or harder to engage with our colleagues? Instead of just blaming you as an individual for your failure to radically transform the minds of everyone you interact with, what are some of the structures in place that might make it easier or harder to engage with folks and make it easier or harder for us to follow through on making change, right? Not a trick question. Andy makes a really good point. Definitely, if we're just going into these situations thinking I am the know-it-all and I have to persuade everybody else, that can be a real problem. So one thing we want to bring into these conversations is open-mindedness. We got a lot of shout outs to patriarchy as an obstacle that's in the way. Um, in some cases, I'm not sure somebody's mentioned this yet. In some cases, the person that you're trying to persuade might be your boss. There might be power differentials that make it harder for you to engage, right? Um, so there are lots of different sorts of structural obstacles in the way. Information asymmetry is a great point as well. We are living in echo chambers and information silos where the information that we're encountering might be very different from the information that they're encountering, right? So there's all sorts of different structures in place, right? Okay. So the good news, however, is that although we are all constrained by our structures and social roles, we also have agency. And there are going to be all sorts of ways in which the goals and mindsets that we take in these kinds of cases can play a huge role in shaping what we do and our opportunities for changing the world. So let's get down to thinking about some concrete tools that we can take going forward. The first tool I would like to talk about, with apologies to Marie Kondo, is the life-changing magic of if-then plans. And this is going to be the first tool on your handout as well. These are concrete plans that specify when, where, and how we put our abstract goals into action. Okay, so let's think again about someone who is trying to cut back on smoking, trying to quit smoking. If they just form an open-ended plan like, I'd like to cut back on smoking, that's super vague, it's super open-ended, it's not clear how to actually try to put it into practice, right? But instead they might form a plan like, if I feel a craving for cigarettes, then I will chew gum, right? And they're saying, what is the concrete situation that I'm interested in, and what is the very specific action that I'm going to take in response in that context? Or here we are halfway through February, about 6 or 7 weeks ago. Many of you may have formed a plan like this. My New Year's resolution is to work out more. How is that working out for me? You don't have to tell. But instead, you might have formed a plan like, when I leave work on Tuesdays, then I will go to the gym, right? And so you're saying, what is the specific situation that I'm interested in, and what is the concrete action that I'm going to take in response? And so the basic idea here is to identify the problem contexts and then formulate concrete plans for how to act in those contexts. A wide variety of research across a range of different contexts shows that these if-then plans are easy to form, easy to remember, and easy to execute in the crunch. So, for example, are you more likely to interrupt women than men? Well, I've got an if-then plan for you. If she's talking, then I won't. Ta-da! You're cured. Congrats. Okay. Other sorts of examples. Okay. If a person underperforms, then I will consider situational causes. Okay. I'll say more about this in the next tool, but I won't leap to assuming that that person just doesn't care or is lazy. I might think about, and this is something that we're almost entirely very familiar with in California, maybe there was car trouble, maybe there was traffic, maybe there were family or work problems. If it's a student, maybe they're overwhelmed by their course load, right? Or here's another one that's particularly salient these days. When I learn about a protest against injustice, then I will show up. Okay. And I'll invite my friends to come along. Guess what predicts whether someone goes to a protest? Okay. Is it just that they care about the issue? Is it just that they're upset? Is it just that they're angry? You might guess a pattern here. The number one predictor of who goes to a protest is if their friends go with them and invite them to come, right? So invite your friends and colleagues to walk the walk with you. Okay, so here is some of your homework going forward to try to be an agent of change, right? Think about what are some contexts where you might be affected by or participating in unfair structures and processes, right? And then what are some plans for response that you can put in place, right? So again, this is all going to be on your handout, but the basic structure is if, and then you describe a certain context, then I will act in a certain way. When I find myself in this situation, this is the thing I'm going to do in response, right? So if a colleague is talking the talk without walking the walk, then I will, right? And here we have a very important ellipsis, a very important ... where each of you is going to fill that in based off of who you are. What is your social location? What kinds of confrontational or conflict styles are you comfortable with? What are the relationships you have with these folks? What are the power dynamics? All of that gets thrown into the bucket of you deciding what you as an individual want to do to handle that sort of situation. But again, one thing that we really want to pull out of this is the importance of accentuating the situation. Too often when we, if something goes wrong in the world, or if we're, observing someone's behavior, too often we try to explain those things in terms of internal traits, right? We might think that this person succeeded because they're hardworking and that person didn't because they're lazy. If something bad happens in the world, we immediately want to point the finger at who is the individual with bad intentions that we can blame, right? And so too often we're overlooking situational factors, right? Maybe this person succeeded because they grew up with lots of wealth and privilege, or because they were just really lucky. Maybe this person's struggling because there are all kinds of structural obstacles that oppress them and hold them back, right? But the good news is that anyone can practice explaining behaviors in terms of situations, right? This is just like any habit that we can practice over time, right? And so instead of just thinking like, she is angry and emotional, you might practice thinking, maybe she is justifiably angry given the situation. Maybe there's something there that is making her angry, that is unjust, and that's why she's angry, right? So I think a really useful case study for thinking about the importance of accentuating the situation is in relation to growth mindset research. So I assume most of us here are familiar with this, but just in case you're not, Carol Dweck and colleagues have studied a contrast between two different ways of thinking about features of us like intelligence or musical ability or athletic ability, where you could either adopt a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. If you adopt a fixed mindset, then you think that like someone just either is smart or they're not. They're either talented at music or they're not. It's just, it's either something that's innate or something that developed early in their life, and you've either got it or you don't. Okay. But instead, pretty much every coach of every high school or middle school or college sports team will instead adopt a growth mindset and talk about just getting a little bit better every day, right? And when you adopt a growth mindset, you think like, if I practice, if I work, I can get better at music, I can get smarter, and so on and so forth, right? When these things get studied in robust scientific empirical contexts, researchers find that sometimes classroom growth mindset interventions work, and sometimes they don't. And meta-analyses that have studied these things find that overall, if you just average the effect sizes of these interventions, sometimes they can be pretty small. But further research has found that a key variable in when a growth mindset intervention works or doesn't is whether the teacher who implements that intervention themselves has a growth mindset towards their students, right? So is the teacher just sort of spouting the talking point? They're just sort of by rote repeating the thing that their boss told them they have to say? Or does the teacher actually believe that their students are capable of growing? Is the class structured so that students can demonstrate growth and prove them right? Right. And so the very natural analogy here is to think about, planting a seed in the right soil, right? Are we planting the seed of growth mindset in the right structural soil where people have the opportunity to actually grow in their social context, right? Now, there's a further criticism that gets raised of growth mindset research and of positive psychology more generally, which is that a lot of folks have reasonably enough been concerned that a lot of this research is too individualistic, right? We're too focused on changing how people think so that they can improve as individuals. Are we too focused on getting individual students to become, better students? Right? Are we ignoring perhaps the larger structural forces that shape educational inequality? But actually, research suggests that while many growth mindset interventions are just focused on improving individuals, they don't have to be. Research finds that we can also adopt growth mindsets towards systems, okay? And research finds that encouraging the belief that systems can change motivates individuals to change them, right? And so this is a way of thinking about these issues that's embodied by all kinds of many of our intellectual heroes like Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, or Iris Marion Young, who talk about things like oppositional consciousness and radical pedagogy, where instead of just thinking about education as cramming a bunch of information into our students' heads, we're thinking about empowering them to be agents of change who see their situations as malleable. And there's, I'm low on time, and so we could do a whole other session just thinking about the ways that these issues connect to all kinds of other mindsets of interconnection and growth that we find in a whole range of indigenous and feminist and non-Anglo-European ways of knowing. But another important tool here is to adopt an approach mindset. And so the idea is to adopt an approach-oriented mindset to our interactions and problem solving. So some studies have participants engage in a conversation with a member of a different race or a different salient social group. And one group of participants is told to adopt one mindset beforehand and another one adopts another. Some are told to adopt a prevention-focused mindset where they're told to avoid appearing prejudiced in any way during the interaction, right? So whatever you do, try really hard. Don't be racist. Don't be racist. Really, really, really don't be racist. Okay. And you can imagine how that conversation might go. But another group of participants is told to approach the interaction as an opportunity to have an enjoyable intercultural dialogue. And what they find is that in that context, people are more likely to find intergroup contact rewarding rather than depleting, right? So here's an example of an if-then plan where we might sort of put an approach mindset into action. Something like, when I meet a new person, then I'll tell myself it's an opportunity to learn. Another really valuable mindset is to try to find common ground. So research finds that if we can find similarities with outgroup members, even over trivial things, then our interactions are more likely to start off on the right foot and unfold in positive ways, right? So do you both prefer apples versus oranges? Correct answer is oranges, right? Are you both rooting for the same bachelor? Are you both reveling in the fact that no one has lost more Super Bowls than the New England Patriots? Okay. Are you both fans of The Office or Pluribus or Love is Blind? Are you both rooting for Sinners for Best Picture? Okay. In fact, there are ways that you can sort of build icebreaker games for students or colleagues, or if you have a new committee or a new task force. For example, if you have everybody do some low-key would you rather questions, would you rather always be 10 minutes late or 20 minutes early? Then if there's certain salient social differences between you, you recognize that there's also some shared humanity. So one thing I do with my students is I have them fill out a tell me about you survey at the beginning of class. This is also something you could do with your colleagues, right? And I'm just trying to find out like what is the music that they're vibing with so that I can give it a listen and then I can, have a sense of where they're coming from. Both approach mindsets and common ground mindsets are specific actions of a much larger and time-tested strategy for promoting social change, and that's intergroup cooperation. So the basic recipe here is we want to get people from different groups to work together toward common goals and system change. The most famous example of this was the desegregation of the US military in World War II. Soldiers who served in segregated platoons were much less prejudiced at the end of the war than soldiers who served in soldiers who served in integrated platoons were much more likely to much less prejudice at the end of the war than soldiers who served in segregated platoons. But we find more humdrum examples in sports teams, in first-year roommates, in unions, okay, and solidarity between unions, right, where all of these are creating context for intergroups who remember the Titans for sure. And so what we want to do is constantly consider context, right? Construct social structures that foster intergroup cooperation. So another piece of our homework is to think about how to do this in the CSU. So one thing that I sort of daydream about is like, what if we had like a team trivia event or like some kind, like sort of modeled on like a pub trivia thing or some kind of online gaming event where we got members of all the different clubs and teams and so on together to participate. But instead of having the campus Democrats be one team and the campus Republicans be another, we mix and match the team so that the campus Democrat and campus Republican are on the same team. And it's like a low stakes thing that people can do together to try to work towards common goals. Okay, so intergroup cooperation is one specific example of a kind of larger scale structural change that we could fight for. And so today's tools, mostly what we've been talking about, are some things that individual somebodies should do. But of course, larger institutional and structural reforms are necessary for fostering intergroup cooperation. So another thing I'd like you to throw in the chat is examples of books or other resources you could recommend on big structural change. Here are a few of the ones that have really been powerful for me. We've got Elizabeth Anderson's Imperative of Integration, which is about the value of intergroup cooperation. My go-to recommendation for making the academy more inclusive is An Inclusive Academy. Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow is still an outstanding text for combating the structural injustices of mass incarceration, and of course, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed as well. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to let you keep thinking about examples of books you could suggest in the chat. But I would like you to invite me back for a session dedicated to the CSU revolution. What are some larger scale structural changes we could, Karl Marx, we always get some marks. We always get Das Kapital for sure. Okay. And so, so stepping back from the ways we've been thinking about this today, uh, is the problem with individuals or is the problem with structures? Okay, when I hear that question, I say, ¿por qué no los dos? If someone comes along and says that individual is doing it wrong, I hate the way that individual is doing it. Okay, my mind goes to what are the structural constraints and incentives that are shaping that person's choices, right? But when, conversely, when someone says like, oh, if I, what does it matter what we do? That's just a large scale structural problem. Okay. Well, where does my mind go? I think about what are the roles that individuals can play to bring about changes in those larger scale structural problems? How can we encourage individuals to change systems? And how can we design systems to empower individuals to become agents of change, right? So both and thinking is about always trying to think about those two questions in tandem. So with that, I want to leave you with one final set of tools related to success, setbacks, and motivation. Very often when we put new interventions in place, we tend to lose motivation to keep pushing, effectively thinking, okay, my work here is done, pat myself on the back, let's go have a snack, right? And that is true even if the new policy we put in place has no effect whatsoever. We still take our foot off the accelerator and think our job is done. So it's incredibly important to collect data, both formally and informally, to see if these tools work for you, right? If you're thinking about trying an if-then plan, get an if-then plan buddy to talk about to say like, oh, I came up with this plan. Let me see how it's going. Okay. Now, when we do come across effective interventions, it's vitally important to treat those interventions as evidence that we can make progress if we keep trying, rather than that we have already met all of our goals. So with that, I want to leave you with two final if-then plans. The first is when we make progress, then we will remind ourselves how far we have to go. And the second is when there are setbacks, then we will keep fighting. All right. Thanks, everybody. Also buy my book.
I do want to ask you one question. We don't have too much time for that Q&A, but first of all,
Sorry.
thank you. That's okay.
It was popping off in the chat. Blame the chat, not me.
Because this is, quote unquote, the CSU edition. And there are some folks who, have the opportunity to work directly with students and feel that impact making, on a daily basis.
Right.
But then there's other folks, someone who works in HR or, their job is data entry and they have like zero interaction with students and can kind of feel like their role doesn't really provide those opportunities for change making. And in your book, you address that in some powerful ways. If you would share that with everybody.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really super important question. So I think there's two kind of points to bear in mind, two ways of thinking about this that can help. The first is, and this is something we get more into in the book, is that when we're thinking about social change, we're often preoccupied with these kind of like flashbulb moments, cutting the ribbon, toppling the statue, passing the new legislation. And we're very focused on like, what's the big signal thing that we're going to do? And we think that that's where all the action and social change happens. And we forget that often that's really just the first step. And so much of the work of social change is actually seeing it through, actually implementing it, actually delivering. And so lots of folks in different contexts have incredibly important roles to play in bringing that about. One of the most potentially disheartening versions of this is there have been these like tree planting initiatives where people plant billions and billions of trees, right? And then they just plant the trees and then they just dip. And then within a couple months, all the trees, the saplings have died. And so it's not just about tree planting. It's also about tree growing. It's also about showing up day after day after day. And I think another really important piece of the puzzle here is that we have agency in how we think about our own roles in our institutions. So one really powerful study here looked at hospital workers, and they looked at custodians and other folks that were part of the institution, and they found that some, for example, custodians thought their jobs were really dreary. that they were, really flat and really boring. But other folks actually found a lot of meaning in their jobs. And what was the difference between the two cases? Well, it turned out that for folks who found meaning in their jobs, they didn't just think that they were clocking in, mopping the floor and clocking out. They thought of themselves as part of the institution that was there to serve patients. So one really striking example is someone who would clean the ceilings in patients' rooms in the hospital because they knew that patients were going to be lying down and looking at the ceiling. And they thought, what if that was my father or my mother or my brother or my sister? How would they feel? Right. And so they understood themselves even if they weren't, directly in a, patient-facing role as being part of the system that is helping students. So stuff like data entry and HR is incredibly important for making this whole thing run. And so the more that we can think about ourselves as, part of an institution that's here to support each other and to support students, then the more meaning we can find in our roles.
Thank you.
Job
There,
job crafting is the technical term for that. Yeah.
job crafting. Um, there's so many comments in the chat, just thanking you for this
Yeah. Give
webinar.
me yeah, let's get some devastating objections though. Come on, I'm a philosopher.
Well, I do
Let
have
me
a
have it.
poll up that hopefully you're all able to interact with that now. Speaking of, gathering data points on, what kind of impact this is having.
Yeah.
We're just curious, after joining this session, do you feel like you have more confidence in your ability to act as an agent of change? And I'm actually not sure if this poll is working, in fact, because I'm not seeing the results popping through. But so if you would do me a favor, folks, and share it in the chat, where you're at now, how you're feeling about your confidence. I'm going to put that prompt right there in the chat. I feel more confident in my ability to act as an agent of change, and unfortunately, it can't be anonymous anymore. But
I'll take it.
I'm
Yeah.
seeing some
Yeah.
agrees, confident, agree.
Yeah.
So thank you, Alex. And I do want to ask producer John, if you do me a favor, I wanted to just send one message to folks about future CSU's Got Talent sessions coming up and our move to CSU Connect. So some of you might be familiar with the CSU's Got Talent page on CSYOU, where you could see the upcoming sessions. And all that's going to be moving to CSU Connect, which is our new intranet system-wide. So speaking of channels for communication, there we go. But I'm very excited about our next upcoming session, something that we have not done before, which is a student spotlight on a topic. And this topic happens to be climate action. So next month, March 24th, we're going to welcome 3 students from across California, representing the different areas, Northern California, Central and Southern California, in collaboration with Megan Jennings from the CSU Climate Consortium. So hopefully some of you can make it to that. If you registered early for the sessions of CSU's Got Talent, this date was not selected yet. So please go and check out that registration and make sure you have this on your calendar if you'd like to attend. Everyone join me in thanking Alex for an incredible session. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining this morning, CSU's Got Talent.
Thanks so much to Maddie and everybody else for coming. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to John and Robin behind the scenes, making sure everything worked for us today. And let's get that.
They made the PowerPoint
going.
look pretty and the handout look A+. So
They did great. Thanks so much, everyone.